So welcome everyone to the Urban Transitions webinar today, focusing on just employment in low carbon economies. I'm Rebecca Wessinghage from the ICLE Secretariat, and I will be moderating today's session. This is the 6th Alliance webinar, so we have been engaging in very interesting discussions on the different Alliance topics, which are mobility, infrastructure, energy, and social transition, which is the topic now. But for those of you who might not have come across the Urban Transitions Alliance before, it is a global network of industrial legacy cities that are committed to urban transitions towards a sustainable future. The Alliance is coordinated by ICLE and funded by the Stiftung Mercator. Before we start with the topic and the discussions of today's session, please let me comment on the setup and some logistics. I would first like to inform you that today's webinar will be recorded, and to minimize background noise, we will keep all attendees muted during this session. If you experience any technical problems, please send us a message in the chat box, which is on the downside of your control panel. Secondly, we will keep the questions of the audience to after the presentations and comments. Of course, if you have a question meanwhile or during the presentation, you can already send us your questions, also using the chat box of your control panel. Yes, to start today's webinar, we will speak about how industrial legacy cities are answering the transformation of the employment sector, and with that, addressing the interconnected challenges of the necessary environmental changes, together with unemployment and inequality as the issues. In today's webinar, we will learn from 2 cities how they are individually addressing those issues. The first presentation will be from the Catch initiative in Charleroi in Belgium, and we'll learn from Thomas Dermin, the head of the delivery unit, how Charleroi is accelerating sustainable employment growth. And the second presentation will come from the city of Pittsburgh, and the presenter will be Mike Robb, and the presentation will focus on employment innovation in the energy sector in Pittsburgh and the collaboration of different actors in this field. Following those presentations, we'll have comments by Sunandan Tiwari, who is Senior Manager for Global Projects at the ICLE World Secretariat here in Bonn. After that, we will have some time to discuss what we have learned and direct questions to the presenters, as I have mentioned before. Before we start with the presentations, I would like to make a few remarks to the topic of the webinar quickly. So the webinar is, or the topic is framed within the field of social transition. That is a cross-cutting topic that relates to all different aspects and levels of sustainable urban transitions. What we will speak about today is the question of how deindustrialization has been impacting the employment sector in the Alliance cities. The cities have faced substantial job losses in legacy sectors such as mining and manufacturing, and in consequence, they needed to restructure their social systems, diversify their economies, and establish more sustainable employment opportunities for their citizens. The question now is how we can use this moment as an opportunity to address the environmental, the economic, and the social issues together. To ensure that the necessary low-carbon transition is just and leaves no citizens behind, local governments need to provide active guidance in the field of education, social protection, and decent work. And the question of today's webinar would be how are cities using the restructuring of their economies as a chance to build more resilient, fair, and inclusive employment landscapes. We have key questions in today's session. The first question would be which strategies and initiatives the Alliance cities have put in place to strengthen and diversify their economies, and which partners they seek to connect to in their cities and regions. Also, we'd like to learn from our participants how the cities established a resilient and diverse labor force and enable access to new opportunities for their citizens through re-education and educational equity programs. Also, more facing towards the future, we would like to understand how the alliance cities are preparing for future employment trends, and in order to strengthen their social systems, if they maybe also consider alternative economic concepts, or what is their take on government regulations. Now I look forward to the first presentation of the webinar today from Thomas on the catch plan in Charleroi. Thomas, the floor would be yours.
Yes, thank you, Rebecca. All right, are you able to see my screen?
Yes, we are. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. So thanks, Rebecca, for this extremely well-framed introduction and for letting me the opportunity to present what we're trying to do in Charleroi in Belgium around the Catch initiative. And let me tell you once again how great it is to be able to share what we're doing in Belgium and benefit from your feedback and from the expertise from other cities. Because I was in Pittsburgh a few weeks ago, and I believe despite the distance, we share a lot, and sharing insights can really benefit this kind of guidance that we try to put in the cities. So let me first tell you a few words about Belgium, just to frame what we're speaking about. So Belgium is this very small country located between France and Germany and the Netherlands. We speak 3 languages in Belgium: German in the east, Flemish or Dutch in the north, and French in the southern region, which is the region of Charleroi. And what will surprise you is that actually Belgium is mostly known to be quite a wealthy country with a very wide open economy, a very central location in Europe, very good infrastructures, and Belgium is, of course, with Brussels, home to several big international institutions like the NATO and like the European Union. What is less known about Belgium is that in Belgium you have huge disparities in terms of economic wealth in between the region. You have Flanders with big cities that I'm sure you know, like Bruges, Ghent, or Antwerp, which are among, I would say, the wealthiest cities in Europe. And in the south, which is the region of Charleroi, you have a few cities like Charleroi, Liège, or Mons, which used to be the economic powerhouse of the country during the first industrial revolution, but which are now still lagging behind. And so you have extreme, I would say, differences in economic indicators between the south of the country, the French-speaking part, and the north part of the country, which is nowadays much more wealthy than the source. Charleroi, you see a small map on the left of on the right of this slide. So it's located in the southern part, and I just took one economic indicator of Charleroi, which is youth unemployment. And on the graph on the left, you have a comparison between, I would say, the different geographical components of Belgium. You see Belgium, which is in terms of youth unemployment quite aligned with the European average, which is, I mean, by any standard, quite high. I mean, around 20%. But what you observe is that the southern part is around 28%, while it's only 14% in Flanders, so the northern part of Belgium. And Charleroi, which is the column on the extreme left, is about 43%, which means that actually it's quite, I mean, it's the kind of like big challenge that we try to address, is that basically today in Charleroi you have about 40-45% of youth that are finding a hard time to find a job. So this gives you, I mean, I won't give a very detailed socio-economic landscape of Charleroi, but I just wanted to highlight this indicator because it kind of strengthened the kind of challenge that we are facing in Charleroi. And I would say that Charleroi sometimes is a bit considered like the Pittsburgh of Europe. It used to be a very intensive producer of coal around World War II. And it has also, I mean, the biggest, I mean, steel factories in Western Europe. And we have, I mean, we have been through a steady decline since, I would say, late 80s till nowadays. And what's quite funny, and what I want to do in this presentation is briefly give you a few words about catch and what is it, why is it special, and what do we do actually. Give you a few words also on something which is quite special in our case. It's the implementation methods that we are using to try to drive change in the city, using the different, I would say, institutional levels that we have in the country. So the regional level, the federal level, but we also work very closely with European institutions, and then share a bit what are the lesson learned from our cities that could be replicated elsewhere. So in Charleroi, in fall 2016, we had a major catastrophe. This catastrophe was the closure of the Caterpillar factory, which was the biggest production facility of Caterpillar outside of the US. And basically, I mean, it had a major impact on the employment structure, because more than 2,000 workers were laid off, plus also indirect workers working for subsidiaries, etc. And in a region where you have more than 20% of an employment rate, 40% for the young people, if you add on top of it those 2,000 people that will become jobless, it was a major catastrophe. The business sector and the politicians get together and they say, look, let's try to use the closure of this factory and the momentum that we have around this catastrophe to apply what Winston Churchill used to say: never let a good crisis go to waste, but instead of letting the crisis go to waste, let's seize the momentum to launch new projects in Charleroi and to try to transition and to stop this slow decline, and to launch ambitious projects to reignite growth in terms of jobs in Charleroi. And that's the origin of Catch. So Catch is basically the strategic plan that has been laid out by the city together with the different governments in Belgium to reignite growth in Charleroi following the closure of this big factory from Caterpillar. So one part of the job we do is, of course, trying to find a future for this specific industrial site of Caterpillar, but it's much more broader in the sense that we try to work on projects across the entire cities to provide meaningful jobs and sustainable jobs for the population of the city. Basically, I find this analysis quite interesting because it tells the entire story about job creation in Charleroi. So if we look at the number of jobs that we have in the city of Charleroi, it used to be around 126,000 jobs in 2005, so a bit more than 10 years ago. So we used to have 126,000 jobs. What happened in the last decade is basically we lost 10,000 jobs, I would say, in old industries. So the mines were already all closed in 2005, but we had still a lot of steel industries and a lot of, I would say, assembling industries. And this is the typical landscape of the Vallée de la Sambre, which is the river in Charleroi, and it looks like, I mean, a typical old industry region. And in those kind of landscape, we have had several big plants that have been closed, and the Caterpillar one is only the last one. And so the old industries in Charleroi, it's mostly steel industries. I'm sure you recognize the logo of ArcelorMittal, but also in the glass industry and in the assembly industry, with Caterpillar being the last example. What happened also in Charleroi, and this is something which is less known also in Belgium, is that over the same period of time, we have also had new sectors that have emerged. And often this is less known because, you know, when a big factory closed, it's the headline of all the newspaper. But when you have a lot of SMEs creating new jobs, it's harder to feel that move. And if you don't make the deep analysis to try to disaggregate what are the plus and the minus, you never see the job creation. So what we didn't catch is the analysis. Where is the growth of jobs coming from in Charleroi? And let's try to bet on those industries that have been able to create jobs in Charleroi. And indeed, in Charleroi, over the same period, we recreated 11,000 jobs. And we split those new jobs in two categories. The first one is what we call external job creation. It means the jobs that have been created by foreign investors. And internal job creation, which means jobs that have been created by local SMEs or by the growth of existing companies. And typically, example of external job creation, for example, we have just north of Charleroi, one of the biggest logistics center of Johnson & Johnson, which covers the entire western part of Europe. It's a huge logistics center that concentrate a lot of employment. Also, thanks to the move of the University of Brussels together with funds from the European level, we have created, but really out of nothing, a new ecosystem in biotech that we called the Biopack. And you have on the slide the two pictures. Basically, what used to be, fields in the early 90s is today one of the most advanced ecosystem in biotech, with around 50 companies concentrating 1,500 jobs. And this has been done over two decades. So this is quite impressive, and it's a good example of local job creation, and that you can invent new specialization clusters. Another example is the airport of Charleroi, Brussels South Charleroi Airport, that you maybe know if you have taken a Ryanair flight. Basically, it used to be a very small airport with only a bit of touristic flights and local flights. In 1997, so only 20 years ago, Ryanair decided to put its first continental basis in Charleroi, and today it's an airport with more than 7 million passengers. And of course, it's still highly dependent on Ryanair. I think we have about 70% of the passengers which are from Ryanair, but the management of the airport has successfully initiated a diversification strategy to try to onboard new companies and create jobs. And this is extremely relevant for us because in the biotech sector, the type of job you create is mostly very highly skilled jobs versus the type of jobs you create around an airport, and in the logistics sector, it's mostly, I would say, lowly skilled people. And of course, we need to invest very heavily in human capital training systems, but we have also to cope with the workforce that we have, and having these job creation in low skilled jobs is very relevant to us. And so the philosophy of Catch, what we are doing is basically we really double clicked on the green boxes, on the boxes with job creation. And the philosophy of the plan of the Catch initiative is to say, look, if we have been able in the past 10 years to create jobs in a certain set of industries, then it's a very good indicator that in the next 10 years will be able to create another few thousands of jobs in those sectors. So let's get the CEOs of those companies together with the government. Let's sit around the table and let's define a list of very tangible and very pragmatic projects that we could work on together to facilitate the growth of these new industries in the region. And so if I look at what's the structure of the catch strategies, basically it's structured around 4 different clusters. Advanced manufacturing, we have a few very big international manufacturing group in Charleroi, like Alstom, the train making company, Thales, which work on satellites, and also a few tier 1 suppliers for either the automotive or the airplane industries. We have a cluster around the airport and logistics, which I mentioned briefly earlier. We have the cluster around biotech, which basically didn't exist at all 25 years ago, but has been extremely successful in recreating a few thousand jobs. And we also have something around creative and digital. And around creative and digital, I know it's very trendy to speak about digital, and I guess that every single city has a digital strategy. But we narrowed it down around everything which is around image processing and virtual reality, because in Charleroi we have a very old tradition around comic books, École de Marcinelle, which is basically one of the, I would say, best renowned, I would say, group of comic writer. And today we still have a few companies working around animated reality, etc. And so we try to build something around them in the booming space of image processing. And so very practically, the Plan Catch is a list of projects in those 4 ecosystems. And the list of projects have been defined basically following a very, I would say, bottom-up strategy by talking to the CEOs, by talking to the local people working in the industry of Charleroi, and making sure that the project we had in mind would make sense to them, because it's in the end the industrial players which are the one leading the implementation. So it's a very top-down, bottom-up approach of defining what would be the project of the strategy. And if you are, I mean, given the short time frame we have, I don't think it's relevant to go through the different projects, but we have material available on our website if you want to deep dive into the different projects that we are working on. And so the ambition of the plan, basically, it's to recreate 6,000 to 8,000 jobs in those 4 sectors. And the reason we call our strategy Catch, of course, it's a bit to play with the Caterpillar story, because Caterpillar is a bit the catalyst that started the entire reflection, and so it's a mix of Caterpillar, Charleroi, Catch, but it's also because it's to catch the growth of the Belgian average and the Walloon average, and Charleroi has been lagging behind the rest of Belgium for the last 40 years. And the ambition that we have with the Catch plan is to catch up the growth of Belgium, which remains a very wealthy and quite prosperous country. Then the big question that the government asked is about implementation. And I took those 2 quotes, which I found very, very relevant, is that we had this very beautiful strategy. But as Churchill puts it, at some point you should look at the results. And how do you make sure that, given the complex set of stakeholders that you have in the local level, how do you make sure that you actually make your project come to reality and that you implement those projects? I also took this quote that I find very spot on from Thomas Edison, which is basically, if you have the vision, which is the catch plan, but you have no execution capability, then it will remain an hallucination. So what we decided to do is that, I mean, there were different strategies that were put forward. Should we appoint someone in the ministry? Should we create a new local body responsible to implement the strategy? Should we give it to the Chamber of Commerce to do it? I mean, I guess the kind of usual discussions you have at local level, how do you implement stuff? And do you rely on a centralized unit at the federal or governmental level? Or do you have a very decentralized team working at the city level? The approach that we took is actually inspired from what Tony Blair has been doing in his second term as a prime minister in the UK, which was basically the setup of a delivery unit. Basically, a delivery unit is a small team which has a very strong mandate coming from the top level of decision makers, and the team has to work on a very small set of key performance indicators. In our case, the single indicators that we have is the number of jobs we create. So we have a very strong mandate, but also a short time frame. So we have a mandate of 3 years, and the objective between, I would say, the shortness of this mandate is to keep the sense of urgency and to push the priorities of the government and of the different stakeholders to make sure that we start the execution. We also have, and that's one particularity of the model of the delivery unit, is what we strive to implement what we call routines with the different stakeholders we work with the government, with the private firms we work with, etc. Meaning that for each project we work on, we have, I would say, weekly meetings, daily checkups, etc., to make sure that nearly on a daily basis we make progress and we continue to work very hard towards the implementation of the plan. In our case, we have a very small and young team that we call the Catch Delivery Unit. We have a mandate of 3 years from the Minister of Economy, and we have a strong mandate from the Minister actually to put a systematic approach to work on the priority projects that we have in the catch plan. And the way our team is structured, basically we have 3 people working, so myself and 2 other people working, I would say, transversally. 2 of them actually are data analysts, because we believe that it's by bringing transparency on the number and on the progress that we can basically build a very strong coalition with all the stakeholders on how to make progress. And then I have 1 expert in the different, I would say, industries and ecosystems that we try to reinforce in Charleroi. I put a few wins, because actually we just started not 6 months ago, but 9 months ago in September 2017. But here are a few wins that we have achieved so far. I won't go through it. You can read it, but basically it's mostly working on long-term growth planning for the airport, building new infrastructure for the biotech clusters. Working on innovation programs together with the government and the leader of the advanced manufacturing hub, and trying to locate new activities in the digital ecosystem. Preparing this small session, I was thinking of what are the key learnings that we want to share with other cities that might be thinking about something similar. I think there are 4 key learnings. The first one is the necessity, especially if you work at local level. I know in the US it's slightly the same, that you need to align the state level, the local level, and the federal level. But what we made sure in our program is to, invest a lot of time in building a very broad consensus on the strategy, together with all the political parties and together with the different level of the governments. And of course, in our case, it was, I would say, facilitated by the fact that we had the catastrophe of the big closure of the Caterpillar plant. And so you really had a very strong sense of urgency and a burning platform that actually nobody could say, no, it's not a priority to work on these things. The second thing, which is quite important in our case, is I would say the delivery methods that we're using. So the mandate is coming from the political world. So the impulse at the beginning is a very strong impulse from the government. Then the set of ideas, the set of projects has been defined bottom up by the business sectors, by the private sectors, because they are the one which are building the future of growth. So they are the one who have the best views on what are the projects that need to be implemented. And then the execution, the implementation is done by an external delivery unit, which has a strong mandate from the political world, but which is completely separate from the existing administration. The third key learning is that, I mean, things works better if they are kept simple. So we try to streamline to the maximum the number of priorities that we work on. We have 15 areas of work, which is already, I believe, too much. If I had to do it again, I would force the people to streamline again the number of priorities. And then also the tracking of performance is extremely important, and using and defining in advance what are actually the key performance indicators that you are trying to optimize is key, because what we discover every day is that the definition of success can be widely different if you speak to one stakeholder or to the other. And in our case, we made the deliberate choice to say, look, the only indicator of performance that we look at is the number of jobs that we create. We could have engineered much more complex measure of success, but it would have made things much more complex, and it would have, started, unuseful conversation with all the stakeholders. And then something that we are trying to implement now is what we call personal leadership and advocacy. Is that for each of the projects that we work on, we try really to find personal leadership in one of the community leader to really put a face on the project, so that actually you have one, I would say, famous guy driving the project, either in the business sector or in the politics, but you need to have one champion for each of your projects, so that at least you know that someone is on the grill if the project is not delivering. And so we really try to work on that to build a very strong coalition of the willing at the city level, and push all together in one single direction, which is the direction of the catch strategy. So that was it for today. As I said, I haven't had time to deep dive into the different projects, but everything is available on our website, catch-charleroi.be. And if you need anything else, I'm at your disposal by email. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Thomas, very much for your very comprehensive presentation, I think. It's been very touching on very interesting points. Maybe we can, when we go later into the discussion, focus a bit on the social and environmental aspects of the transition that has been initiated and answered to. I think it's also very interesting that you identified very open similarities to the city of Pittsburgh. So maybe after the Pittsburgh presentation, we would understand a bit more about the specific strategies that you both cities have in common. So I would now like to pass on to the original city of Pittsburgh and Mike Roth as the presenter. So Mike, the floor would be yours.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you very well.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone. My name is Michael Roth. I'm going to be speaking for Grand Urban today. I'm an AmeriCorps Vista serving with the city of Pittsburgh, and I will be with the city for a year, mostly doing disaster preparedness, Rebecca, can you see my screen okay?
Yes, we can see it very well. So please go ahead.
Okay.
We're interested.
Great. Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. So the city of Pittsburgh is located in the state of Pennsylvania. We're in the southwest corner of the state. We're at the confluence of two rivers, the Allegheny and Monongahela, that forms into the Ohio. And our topography is fairly hilly, separating the various neighborhoods, both geographically and culturally as well. So most of our history has been based in what we're known for the steel industry. It started pretty early on in the city's history with the beginning of the Civil War in the United States. We were essentially the arsenal for the Northern Union during the Civil War. And as our manufacturing and steel industry continued, we supported the war efforts both during World War I and World War II. After the end of World War II, we slowly transitioned into the commercial sector, where we created about 50% of the United States steel. So unfortunately, the steel industry felt a lot of pressures from international manufacturing. And when that hit Pittsburgh, we lost half our population at that time, being 300,000 people, almost overnight leaving the city of Pittsburgh. So following the collapse, we were left with poor air quality, very few people, and all the loss of the 300,000 people led to even more losses from support industries. However, we have rebounded through technology, the knowledge economy, and various other innovations. So right now we have a population of 300,000 people. We still have our industrial past of having 445 bridges that were support systems for the steel industry. Our housing stock is fairly old, with most of it being built before 1940. And we have about 40% of our population has a bachelor's degree or advanced degree. So like I mentioned before, we have three rivers that sort of define the borders of the city, surrounded by green hillsides, very hilly topography, which makes it very difficult to get from place to place. And that physical separation has been a factor since our early beginnings and where people settled and where immigrants to the city were settling. So it created a lot of different subunits within the city. And this led to the creation of our 90 distinct neighborhoods, which is great because we do have very committed people living in these neighborhoods who have a strong identity with their neighborhood, but it also leads to the issues that come from fragmentation and separation. So shortly after the fall of the steel industry here in the city, the Allegheny Conference was formed, named after our county, Allegheny County, which the city of Pittsburgh is in. So in the top right of this picture is the members of the Allegheny Conference who set out to redesign the city of Pittsburgh from its industrial past to try and lay a path to the future for different industries. So as you can see from the picture in the left, this would have been the city of Pittsburgh after the Allegheny Conference initiatives. So at the very point where the two rivers meet, used to be all steel mills, and almost the entire stretch of both sides of the river would have been covered in heavy industry. So as you can see here, there's some new skyscrapers, a large park at the point, and a few other amenities that would not have been there just a few years earlier when the industrial scars of Pittsburgh's past were still there. So as you can see, our population peaked in 1982. In the 80s is about when the large-scale businesses started moving out of the city without the presence of the steel industry, as well as the poor air quality. A lot of corporate headquarters began to leave the city of Pittsburgh, having our population. And right now, you can see we have sort of still plateaued at that 300, or about half the population, with our unemployment So this is the city of Pittsburgh now. It looks vastly different from the city that it used to be. As you can see, that park at the point is still there. And there's the air quality, at least visually, seems very good, but we still are having some issues with that to this day. We still are slightly connected to our industrial past. As you can see in the bottom left, there are coal barges that go through the city every single day to power plants. So that is still a mark from our past that is leading to some of the air quality issues. So I'm in the Division of Sustainability and Resilience, and we look at all the threats to the city as either a shock or a stress. So as you can see to the left, the city is facing obviously extreme weather events, infrastructure collapse, hazmat accidents, and economic collapse. Those are always things that we're worried about. However, we try our best to install buffer systems within the city. So for instance, with the climate change and extreme weather events, the weather events we're mostly concerned about are severe winter weather, as well as large rain events. So we have very strong initiatives for snow removal and also for water retention systems throughout the city. So we're trying to encourage as much stormwater mitigation as possible, even at the residential level. So now we'll look at stresses. So these are the things that continue to sort of hum in the background all the time in the city. So obviously from our industrial past, we have lots of environmental degradation that needs remediated. We have aging infrastructure that was originally built for the purpose of a large-scale industrial industry. And now we're trying our best to adapt to the Pittsburgh that is now. But it's still quite taxing on both the city and the county from a repair standpoint. Like I said before, with the rough topography, we still have economic and racial inequality. And again, with the 90 different neighborhoods, we still have quite a bit of fragmentation, which can make any sort of initiative hard to disperse across the city. So right now, we still have 300,000 people. Regionally, we have 2.3 million. And like I mentioned earlier, our population peaked in the 20th century at 600,000. And then declined. Our population is currently declining slowly, but it's getting much younger. I'm sure people know about the potential for Amazon to come here. And we have had quite a bit of growth in our tech sector, which is responsible for the younger population. Right now we have a Google headquarters as well as an Apple headquarters here, smaller size headquarters. As well as we have the autonomous vehicle programs with both Uber and Ford being primarily run from the city of Pittsburgh. So the region's GMP is $131 billion, and 65% of Pittsburgh is white and 26% is African American. However, with our student population, that is becoming more diverse. The median income family income is $38,000. And we are still challenged by racial and economic disparities throughout the city. So the largest sectors right now are growing right now are computers and technology, construction, architecture, and engineering. And our top three industries are healthcare, professional business services, and retail. So shortly after the fall of the steel collapse, when we were restructuring the city, we always like to say we went for eds and meds, so that being education and medicine. So for instance, the city of Pittsburgh began investing in its nonprofits, so those being the hospitals and the universities. So we still have 5 universities within the city of Pittsburgh's boundary, and we have 2 large healthcare systems operating within the Pittsburgh area as well. And sort of how these entities made themselves unique was the city of Pittsburgh, the University of Pittsburgh focused deeply on new and innovative health initiatives. So for instance, the city of Pittsburgh was the first to do emergency medicine in any large scale way, as well as doing regenerative medicine studies as well. When it comes to the other universities, Carnegie Mellon University is obviously well known for its technology and has made a name for itself with robotics. So these various ways that the different city nonprofits and educational institutions sort of made themselves unique has really helped the city move forward. So obviously with those sorts of assets in the city, we've had a huge growth in the technology sector, and followed by that has been sort of the idea and push for more environmentally friendly environments and initiatives. So that's sort of the reason why the city of Pittsburgh has 2030 goals, 100% renewable electricity by 2030, and 100% fossil fuel-free fleet for the city operations, trying to foster sort of the desires of some of the industries that have been coming here lately. Like I was mentioning before, on the right-hand side, you can see one of Ford's Argo AI vehicles, which is autonomous. The bottom right is Carnegie Mellon's campus. To the left of that, we have some of the robotics projects. And on top, we have the University of Pittsburgh, which does a lot of outreach with STEM, so science, technology, engineering, and math. And this is sort of a trend we've been seeing throughout the city. Lots of different technology and science type initiatives trying to reach out from everyone from people with PhDs or people that are still very young in various youth groups, and trying to get everyone into the STEM sector. So obviously with the large loss of population and a population that was geared towards the steel industry and manufacturing, we need to retool and refit our workforce. So one of the key examples of that is in the center top picture. That's our Energy Innovation Center, where we have some of the top leading energy experts in the region, as well as youth groups going there to learn how to learn different trades related to energy. So there's quite a few interesting projects going on right there. One of the more novel ones is complete DC energy systems, sort of going back to our past when Nikola Tesla was here working for Westinghouse on similar projects. So we're reaching back into our past a little bit, but to move towards the future. So top 5 sectors in clean tech jobs for the United States. Number 1 being solar, and actually the city of Pittsburgh is the largest solar market for Tesla right now. We've had a huge increase in the number of home installations for solar, and hopefully soon we'll be looking into solar energy for city usage as well. Also, in the city of Pittsburgh region, as it relates to these U.S. numbers, we've had quite a large number of entities move into the conservation and efficiency space, as well as smart grids. So the city of Pittsburgh currently has around 5 smart grid and microgrid projects going on within the city, and that's something we look forward to continue pursuing in the near future. That's it on my end.
Thank you, Michael, for your presentation. I think it was very interesting to see also how the economic transition had a big demographic impact. Maybe when we go into the discussion, we could learn a bit more about the Future of Work program. From what I understood, you cooperate with the Carnegie Mellon University, and you work on employment innovation in the energy sector. So maybe we could a bit later discuss how also from the education side you would work a bit to accompany and guide the transition that is happening. But before we come to the discussion, I would like to pass on the floor to Sunandan to provide comments on the presentations that we've now seen. And I want to thank the 2 city contributions for their presentations at this point.
Thank you, Rebecca, and a big thank you to you, Thomas and Michael, for your fascinating presentations. I think both were excellent examples of how cities can actually, reinvent themselves. And I think what you've demonstrated very clearly here through your presentations is that often you actually need a shock to cause a change or a transformation. But what you also need is you need the vision, you need innovation and ingenuity, you need perseverance, and to be able to identify the windows of opportunity and to leverage them, and to move forward in an improved or more sustainable trajectory of growth. So I think there are a lot of lessons that cities around the world can draw on from your experiences, and it really shows a way ahead for a number of cities which have faced similar situations or might even face similar situations in the coming future. I think three aspects that really jumped out at me while listening to both the presentations were, the first one was learning. It is very interesting to see how in both your presentations you talk about looking at the past and looking ahead, and really having the data, and having these kind of, from a systems perspective, having these feedback loops, so that there is constantly a process of learning as you move ahead. For me, and the second one for me was innovation. You're bringing in new ideas. You're not trying to repeat what was there in the past, but bringing in innovation, not only in terms of technologies, like we just heard from Pittsburgh, but also innovations in terms of institutional structures from Charleroi, where we heard about the delivery unit that they adopted. And the third aspect for me was engagement. The engagement at a political level, and a lot more importantly, engagement of the public, of really having a very inclusive process. So these were, I think, three key aspects that really jumped at me across both the presentations. I would just like to raise a couple of other issues or share some of my thoughts, because it was interesting to see that both cities also have economic disparities to deal with. And one of the big challenges when you're actually looking at transitioning or transformation is, how do you actually deal with the lowest denominator in your ecosystem? How do you actually raise the bottom line, so to speak? And therefore, are you actually being able to reach out to, the most disadvantaged social categories or the most marginalized in your cases? And it would be, I think, interesting to also hear from you in terms of what kind of strategies that you had for raising that bottom line. Another one was in terms of of dealing with trade-offs, because any kind of an opportunity always has a trade-off that you have to manage. In the case of, say, whether you are changing land use patterns from, just take the example from Charleroi, from, say, the agricultural park to, there was this agricultural land which changed into a biopark. So, what were the trade-offs there? How did you deal with those trade-offs? Because it is good to engage with different stakeholders, but every stakeholder comes in with a different vested interest, and so managing those is also quite challenging. Another issue, especially when you're talking about being more resilient, is the issue of emergence, because very often when you are transitioning or transforming into a different state, there are expected and unexpected outcomes that you actually have to deal with from the actions that are taking place. I mean, some of the unexpected outcomes are also positive, but several of them could be negative. For example, in terms of just when you think about globalization, has led, depending on which school you come or what you believe in, that it has helped a lot of people also kind of move out of poverty, but has also led to a lot of social issues such as crime and so on, much higher crime rates and so on. So, dealing with this thing of how do you then deal with, and I think in this case, would be around the issue of, say, gentrification, because if you are now attracting a lot of new talent from outside as well, I'm sure, because of the industries that you have. So you have a lot of talent coming out, and if you already have inbuilt disparities, how do you see that you are actually not marginalizing the marginalized further, and having to deal with issues of gentrification, for example. And finally, for me, there is also the whole challenge from a resilience perspective of how do you actually maintain systems that are resilient, even when you're in a state when you're not really facing any shocks, so that the collapse that was already experienced in the past, does not repeat itself. So, these were some of the issues that I just wanted to touch upon. And I think if there is time, Rebecca, I would like to hear from Charleroi, probably on the issue of trade-offs, because it is interesting to see that that you have a lot more activity around airports, and therefore there is, in that sense, there would probably be more emissions, but you might have strategies in terms of offsetting these emissions from this increased air traffic that is there in your city. And from Pittsburgh, it would be, I think, this whole issue of how would you ensure that, or whether you do any strategies to ensure that there's this gap, or this economic disparities, this gap between the haves and have-nots is not actually widening. Typically what you're seeing is the middle class that band becoming much broader, but the gap between the haves and the have-nots is actually increasing. So because a lot of the skill sets that you are actually promoting also require high skills, and I assume a certain amount of education, so that the strategies you have are not marginalizing those marginalized further. So these are just a couple of questions which I just like to put forth to you, and share my thoughts on this. So I think I'll just end there, Rebecca.
Thank you very much, Sunandan. I think that was a great summary and outlook, and you mentioned very important points connecting to the presentation. So I would just want to give back your questions to the presenters. Maybe first to Thomas. You specifically stressed the question of the trade-off connecting to the turning of agricultural land into industrial park, and also maybe the question of resilience, how this is addressed in Charleroi. So Thomas, would you want to answer to that question? He might not be answering at the moment, so maybe then Michael could. I'm sorry, Thomas, are you able to hear us?
Yes, sorry, I was on mute. So to the question of Sunandan, and I think he highlighted two of the difficult cases we had in Charleroi. One is how do you accommodate the growth of the airport, or how do you offset emissions, and also how do you, we believe it's a just way to create jobs, because you create lowly skilled jobs around an airport. But how do you mitigate this with the other, I would say, ethical obligation that you have around environmental transition? So this is one part, and also the trade-off with the constraints that you impose on the environment, on the neighbors, all the noise issues. It's something we dealt with. And the second question is indeed, as it was shown on one of the slides I presented, around how do you decide on land allocation, and in this case of the Biopack, basically we transform an area which used to be fields into a Biopack. So on the airport, first, on the two cases, what I believe is again how you, the need for unified strategy at the city level, and this can only be done if you have a very strong burning platform, which makes your case easier to pass, because you have one unified voice at the city level saying, hey, this is a priority. Maybe it's true that some people are going to suffer from the growth of the airport, but we are in a city where we have 30% of unemployment, and the growth of the airport is one of the few drivers of job creation that we have. It's a priority that we have to play on. And of course, we're going to mitigate the cost for those who are going to bear the burden of this growth of the airport, but the question is not whether we're going to do it or not. It's whether how we are going to accommodate that growth. And with the airport in particular, I mean, there were heavy, I would say, heavy investment done by the government to isolate the houses of the neighbor, to reduce as much as possible the noise and the negative externalities from the airport for the neighbors. We try to, with the firms around the airport, to work on low emission programs, on new innovation to the, I would say, airplane industry, to try to, I would say, mitigate the and offset the CO2 emissions of the economic activity. But it's indeed a thing that we continuously need to work on. On the Biopack, where we actually transform it through a rural area into a biotech ecosystem, it's something that we needed to do at some point, and we negotiated with the farmers that basically we would do it there, but it would be the stop of the urbanization of the area. So we would do it once, but we would not expand. The reason that we did it in a new area is that basically we have, and that's a bit the irony of the situation, is that we have huge areas in the city which are, I would say, completely devastated but available. But the issue we had, there were two types of issue we had. First, in certain areas, there were 90% of, for example, former steel producing areas, 90% of the businesses were dead, but we still had one or two rolling mills that were functioning. So it's quite difficult to set up a new biopark in the clean tech industry next to an active steel mill. So it's quite, I mean, you have this kind of phasing issues, and now basically all the mills are gone, so it's easier to try to reconvert the entire area. And the second issue that we have, and I've seen examples, including in Pittsburgh, where they have been extremely efficient at dealing with that, is the cost of depollution. So I mean, these land have been used for tens, I mean, maybe 100 years as very intensive industry land. And now the businesses that were exploiting the factories have gone bankrupt. And now it's a huge burden for the public finance to depollute those grounds. And it's a real challenge to get the financing and to get it in a short time frame to be able to reallocate land to new projects.
Okay, thank you. I think you again raised interesting points there that could have separate discussions. I think the reuse of industrial land was something that we also addressed in a former Alliance webinar. Yeah, but before we continue this discussion, I would also like to provide the opportunity for Michael to answer to the questions of the commentator. Specifically, I think it was about the widening of the social gap that could be a side effect of the bringing in of more skilled workers, and also the issue of gentrification, and then maybe also how the job market can be made, or what strategies you would use to have a more resilient job market in the future. So yeah, Michael, would you like to answer on that?
Sure. So I'd say we're sort of addressing that in two ways. The first being, I think, as you hinted to before, a lot of our universities are doing outreach and education, specifically with reskilling of jobs. So identifying people that might be left behind because their industry is no longer here, or they're just new to the job sector, and giving them the tools and education necessary to join sort of this new direction Pittsburgh is going. Most of the city universities have already created sort of feeder programs for the healthcare industry and education industries. And I think we're starting to see that transition for different entities serving as these fast tracks to whether it's coding or engineering or things like that. So for instance, CMU Carnegie Mellon has their worker skilling initiative. So they essentially created a platform that people that have lost jobs from their industry being taken away or have just been displaced by the market because of new technologies, they'll bring them onto this platform and help them identify potential jobs and education programs that would enable them to rejoin the job market. The second thing is, we mentioned before the widening gap, and one of the ways the city is directly addressing that is we just made it through the first round of the Bloomberg Mayor's Challenge, which essentially is a grant program that allows us to address a major issue in the city, so that being energy burden. So despite the city of Pittsburgh having some of the cheapest energy prices in the country because of our local natural gas drilling, with the old housing stock, the energy bills take up a large proportion of people's income, especially in impoverished neighborhoods or neighborhoods that have been disconnected from our new tech boom. So with the Bloomberg competition, we're trying to offer low cost, easy and simple ways to reduce the energy burden in people's homes, so that, as I mentioned before, we have shocks and stresses, so that energy burden has been a stress on the city since those homes have been built. So if we can ease that stress, that's a little more money in the pockets of those who have been feeling that energy burden over a long period of time. The other thing the city's doing is we try to make the city as approachable as possible to people that have new ideas, no matter where they come from. So we have the PGH Lab initiative, which essentially allows for free any city resident or anyone operating within the city to propose an idea to the city, and we partner them up with a city department to trial whatever it is they may have. So it could be a new app, it could be a new technology, and it's just a very easy from the ground way of getting people into testing their products, which then allows them to get funding from some of our numerous different STEM programs within the city. And I think just in general, we're seeing a lot of the high schools as well start to adopt different classes and even building new buildings to support more of the STEM side of things, so that they can feed their students right into the workforce of the future of Pittsburgh. So if you have any other questions on that, I'd be happy to address that.
Thank you, Michael, for answering to the questions of the commentator, Sunandan. I would now like to open the floor for the broader audience to direct their questions also at the presenters. You can either use the chat box in your control panel and type in your questions, or you could raise your hand by clicking on the hand symbol on the left side of your control panel. In both cases, please quickly indicate who you would direct your question to, and if you're speaking, please quickly introduce yourself also. I have a first question that would relate to what we now learned from Michael on the education side. It is directed to Thomas and Charleroi. And the question would be, first, how many stakeholders were involved in the quick wins that you showed in the presentation over the past 6 months? And also if there has been a strategy to provide training to local residents so that they can benefit from these new jobs created, so that the quick wins are spread across the city. And I would maybe add to that if like social equality is also considered in that. Yeah, coming back to what the presenter said about the marginalized parts of societies, how we can make sure that they also benefit from the progress that has been made. So yeah, Thomas, would you want to answer to that question?
So yeah, the topic of education is very high in the agenda of what we try to do. And I would say we work with 2 types of stakeholders. We work, I would say, in Belgium, I would say 95% of the education is done with public schools. Even the professional schools are public. And basically, given the short time frame that we have, if you try to modify a system which is as complex as education system in any country, you have two ways to do it. Either you try bottom up to make the system move, but it's I would say a huge challenge, and you will face, especially in this kind of organization, huge inertia and resistance to change. Or you adopt the strategy that we have been working on in Charleroi for the last year, and which appear, I mean, at least from the indication that we have so far, to be quite effective. So what was the approach that we took? Basically, what we did is we did a mapping in France, in Belgium, in Germany, so in all the neighboring countries. What were the most, especially for, I would say, the digital education, what were the most efficient new education model that we could find? So you have a lot of, I would say, new NGOs or new, I would say, non-profit organizations, etc., launching new education models and trying small scale in one specific city or two specific cities to demonstrate the relevance of the model, using new teaching methods, leveraging peer-to-peer pedagogy, and using video-based content, etc. So completely disruptive ways of teaching. What we did is basically we tried to systematically map those new models and those new players, and we say, hey, look, why, if we find funding for you, do you want to come in our city in Charleroi and try your model as a small pilot in Belgium? And actually, we were quite successful with a few to attract them in our city to pilot their model. And what we observed is actually very funny, is that because we were bringing new type of players that were typically non-traditional education players, non-publicly funded education players, what we observe is that the traditional players, the publicly funded education providers, felt completely threatened, and they become to move very fast to adapt the content of the program and to invest heavily, to reinvest heavily in education locally. And so that's the way we use to challenge a bit the education model, is you try to bring new entrants that have a radically different model to education, and doing so you force the existing ones to move and be much more proactive to the needs of the job market.
Thank you, Thomas. I have another question coming in directed at Pittsburgh and Michael, and the question would be if there are activities in Pittsburgh that not only focus on the group of STEM and life science and engineering, but also if there are job creation programs that focus more on opportunities in softer sectors, being, for instance, the humanities, arts, or sectors in this range. So, Michael, is there anything that you could provide on this question?
Sure. So yeah, and I apologize if it came off as we weren't doing anything in those sectors. No, we have a very strong sort of arts and museum, I guess you would say, sector in the city of Pittsburgh. We have numerous training programs for more of the common trade skills like bricklaying or carpentry that have popped back up in the city of Pittsburgh. Most of those initiatives have been led by nonprofits. However, I will say through city operations, we've been trying to integrate some of that change directly in our request for proposals. So when we go out for projects, for instance, I'm working on a solar energy project. We're going to be requiring the company that would put the solar in to have a job force education component, and we have that through a number of our different projects that we're doing. The city itself has quite a few opportunities when it comes to the arts and humanities with our museums and across our library network called the Carnegie Library of Pittsburgh. They focus heavily on the arts and literature and various other aspects in their programming. So I'd say we probably don't have a direct impact in that sort of area when it comes to arts and humanities, but we do have a very active nonprofit sort of side of the community that's been very active.
Thank you for this. Given the advancement in time, I would maybe like to address a last round to both panelists, and I'd like to bring back the focus of the discussion a bit more to the overarching transition perspective. So what we had initially seen as a framing of the webinar was the question how we could use the transition that is happening and the different initiatives also in the employment sector to address the different questions as a whole, the different transition areas, meaning how we can use the economic transition also to address the social issues, but also the environmental issues. And we have seen or learned from the commentator that we're looking always into trade-offs, or that it's very hard to find a balance between those different areas that might sometimes come off as opposing, but I think they don't necessarily have to. So I would just like to hear the thoughts of the both presenters on this bigger question and bigger picture, and maybe also connected to that, where do you think the local governments would come in, like talking about regulations, or how you would address the bigger picture in a way that we can all use this opportunity in a good way. So maybe Thomas, if you have any thoughts on this, I would be happy if you share them with us.
I would say that what groups us together in this webinar and in the organization that you are leading is the fact that at some points the city that we represent were the leaders of the industrial revolution. During the first industrial revolution, the cities that we are working for, that we are active in, were leading the world, and were concentrated massive amount of R&D, massive amount of research, high investment, and massive job creation. Then, and at least is the case of my cities, during the second part of the 20th century, we lost that I would say high-ranking position, and during the new industrial revolution, I mean the second one, we were not at the forefront of what has been done in terms of industrial development, and the center that has concentrated R&D, investment, and job creation has been moving elsewhere. Now, as you said, we are on the eve of a new revolution, which includes a much more resilient view on economic development, a much more, I would say, socially and environmentally cautious view on economic development, and also completely new industries that will emerge. And actually the fact that we are on the eve of a new revolution is a massive opportunity for cities like us, because actually we have some space available to develop new activities. If you look what we are doing in Charleroi, we are, I mean, creating space out of nowhere for completely new industries that did not exist 10 years ago. You have a population of people that actually are already very resilient, because they have been, I mean, suffering and trying to do a lot with very few resources for the last 30 years, because they were already actually living in a world of scarcity because of industrial decline. And so I believe that I mean, it's a very strong time for cities like us to get together, because it's a very strong opportunity to invent a new environmental and economic system, and that we are in a very good position to do it in cities like us.
Thank you for your perspective. Is there anything you would like to add, Michael, from Pittsburgh's perspective?
Sure. I think I would just say that from the city's perspective, what we've been trying to do is take full advantage of, as I mentioned before, the shocks and stresses that we face. You know, we could look at them as these sort of scary things that are always threatening us, but we can also look at them as huge opportunities for jobs. So as I mentioned before, we have infrastructure issues, environmental degradation, and aging infrastructure. Those are all things that can turn into jobs, and those are things that we sort of invest in, and a lot of our partners invest in as well. From the sustainability side of things, though, I think there's just huge potential within the city of Pittsburgh to enhance jobs that are directly related to sustainability and resilience. So as I mentioned before, we have the microgrid projects, which not only serve to create jobs for a sustainable economy, but also serve to help us during times of disaster and help business continuity as well. So I think there's wins in our weaknesses that we can take advantage of, whether that be from energy or weather disaster events, things like that. Even our fragmentation, there are jobs there that can help mend that fragmentation. So I think if you can identify what your shocks and stresses are, you can also identify future jobs, or at least areas you can put your efforts towards to create jobs like that.
Thank you for this view and perspective. I don't think there's anything to add at this point. I think there is a lot of potential that clearly came out today. I think both of you shared a few insights on specific initiatives where all the participants can look into a bit further after the webinar. So for now, I would really like to thank all participants for their individual contributions, and also the audience for providing their questions. So if you have any further questions, you would like to continue the discussion, or you don't know how or where to learn about the specific activities in both Charleroi and Pittsburgh, please just send us a quick email to urbantransitions@eclay.org. We'll be happy to provide the correct information, continue the discussion, or put you in touch with our presenters from today. And you will also find more information on the Urban Transitions Alliance on our webpage, which is indicated here. So all our webinars will be or are recorded, and they will be available at our website also at urbantransitions.org/alliance webinar series. So if you're interested also in the past webinars, for example, the one on urban generation and place making, talking about redevelopment of industrial sites, please just take a look. Apart from that, I just wanted to thank